makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
Much to the delight of right-wing populists and sympathizers of right-wing populists, the FBI has claimed to find very little evidence that the US Capitol attack on January 6th was actually coordinated. Let's look at the report from Reuters on what happened. So the FBI has found scant evidence that the January 6th attack on the US Capitol was the result of an organized plot to overturn the presidential election result, according to 4 current and former law enforcement officials. Though federal officials have arrested more than 570 alleged participants, the FBI at this point believes the violence was not centrally coordinated by far-right groups or prominent supporters of then-President Donald Trump, according to their sources who have been directly involved or briefed regularly on the wide-ranging investigations. 90 to 95% of these cases are one-off cases, said a former senior law enforcement official with knowledge of the investigation. Then you have 5% maybe of these militia groups that were more closely organized. But there was no grand scheme with Roger Stone and Alex Jones and all of these people to storm the Capitol and take hostages. FBI investigators did find that cells of protesters, including followers of the far-right Oath Keepers and Proud Boys groups, had aimed to break into the Capitol, but they found no evidence that the groups had serious plans about what to do if they made it inside. Well, for starters, this is starting to sound like, well, at least these guys were kind of coordinated in the idea that they were going to break in. What happened afterward? I mean, there was clearly no plan to establish a new government led by that shaman dressed guy with the horns. But this does sound like at least some people, I would say, maybe if it was just 5% or 10% as they claim. But this was important because these could have been the guys who were basically leading the charge. Anyway, they alleged that one Proud Boy leader recruited members and urged them to stockpile bulletproof vests and other military-style equipment in the weeks before the attack, and on January 6 sent members forward with a plan to split into groups and make multiple entries to the Capitol. This is starting to sound like a plan by, at least by the Proud Boys. Damn. Anyway, Trump made an incendiary speech at a nearby rally shortly before the riot, repeating false claims that the 2020 election was stolen and urging supporters to march on the Capitol to pressure lawmakers to reject Biden's victory. In public comments last month, a Democratic-led congressional committee formed to investigate the violence. Police officers injured in the mayhem urged lawmakers to determine whether Trump had helped instigate it. Some Democrats said they want him to testify. But the FBI has so far found no evidence that he or people directly around him were involved in organizing the violence, according to the 4 current and former law enforcement officials. Now, a reminder, January 6th was the day in which Congress was going to certify Joe Biden's victory. So you already had a climate in the air after weeks of conspiracy mongering over this idea that the election was stolen and, you know, all the QAnon nutters saying that eventually it was, you know, Trump was going to somehow, you know, to this day, they're still arguing that somehow Trump is going to be reinstated. But one source said there was been little, if any, recent discussion by senior Justice Department officials on filing charges such as seditious conspiracy to accuse defendants of trying to overthrow the government. They have also opted not to bring racketeering charges, often used against organized criminal gangs. So here's the thing. Here's why I'm not going to read the rest because we already got the gist of it. Here's the thing. Basically, what a lot of people on the right and a lot of people who are simping for the right, and I'm looking at you, Glenn Greenwald, they've been arguing for quite some time that this was not a, quote, insurrection. They hate that word because insurrection means that it wasn't just a protest that got out of hand, that had some more serious intent behind it. And these people, like I said, Glenn Greenwald, who's had a field day after this was posted, the only thing more deranged than claiming Russia had taken over control of the US through blackmail is calling January 6th an insurrection. There are people who have spent every day talking about January 6th ever since it happened, and now talk about it more than ever as if it's the most historically momentous event rather than a 3-hour riot that got put down, and I can't imagine a more dreary or empty existence. So they've been trying to play it down, say that it was just a riot that got out of control, and not that it was an insurrection. They have a lot of issues with that word. But let me explain something. Insurrection, there's nothing in the definition of insurrection that necessitates the idea that it had to be planned at all. And in terms of Trump's role in this, well, he clearly knew he had an audience that was fired up by weeks of conspiracy theories. Not just, conspiracy theories related to the election for weeks, but conspiracy theories in general for years. He knew he had these people fired up. And even if from his own mouth did not come the words like, we're going to topple the government or we're going to, reinstate me, you got to know what your audience is for these kind of things. And I'm just going to play a snippet of that speech that he gave, a couple of hours before. And it's a very long speech, 70 minutes, but this is the bit that matters.
Now it is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down.
He wasn't there with them.
We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women, and we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them.
The traitors.
Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
Now, you have to read between the lines here. What does that mean? You can't be weak. You have to be strong. That basically means you have to take whatever measures are necessary to ensure that the outcome that I want, which is to reinstate me, to make Congress certify that I win in any way, that's the outcome that you want. And you can't be weak by just, having a little protest outside the Capitol. You're going to do whatever is necessary. That's what the audience is hearing. And so if you have, even if it was just a 5-10% of those people in the crowd who did have some organized plan to try and get into the Capitol, and were even prepared by having bulletproof vests and things like that, you can't say this was not coordinated. I mean, the idea that this was an insurrection is still valid. And just because they didn't have a plan of what to do next, well, in many respects, I don't think they even needed one. I mean, the idea was to go inside, capture the Capitol, cause as much chaos and mayhem as possible. I'm sure that if they got their hands on, we're very lucky that there were no Congress people inside, that they had been properly evacuated. But can you imagine what would have happened if one of those clowns have gotten their hands on AOC or Ilhan Omar or even Nancy Pelosi? You can't just think that nothing would have happened. Now, again, I want to really stress this point. Nothing about the definition of an insurrection necessitates that it be planned. And I'm going to give you an example of something much worse than an insurrection. Way worse. Infinitely worse than an insurrection. A genocide. That was not planned. And that's Rwanda. Rwanda in 1994 had been prepping for the moment that something violent was going to happen. And in the matter of days, we went to like full-scale slaughter between two populations. Now, there was no evidence at the time. And, there have been, the statements that have been made after all these trials. The ICTR, which is the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, has, quote, unable to prove that a conspiracy to commit genocide existed prior to 7 April 1994. That's when the then president was assassinated. His plane was shot down. The supposed mastermind, Theoneste Bagosora, was acquitted of that charge in 2008, though he was convicted of genocide. Andre Wichaua, an expert witness for the ICTR prosecution, noted in 2010, what the Office of the Prosecutor has consistently failed to demonstrate is the alleged existence of a conspiracy among the accused, presuming an association or pre-existing plan to commit genocide. This is the central argument at the core of its prosecution strategy, borrowing from the contentions initially put forth by academics and human rights defenders. With the exception of 2 judgments confirmed on appeal, the trial chambers have uniformly found the prosecution's proof of a conspiracy wanting, regardless of the case. So, can you have a genocide where it wasn't planned, and by using the same language of the FBI that these were mostly one-offs? Yeah, if you can murder 400 or 800,000 people. However, we don't actually know how many people died because it happened so quickly. Could you have just 400 or 800,000 one-off murders? Yes. Is it still a genocide? Yes. So this idea that it had to be planned, that every single person who stormed the Capitol had to be part of a pre-existing plan, is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. It does not take away the argument that it was an insurrection. And when I was reading this bit, like the parallels to how much, the far right under Trump has been kind of prepping for their moment, and this could be anything. Like, that's the scary bit. The spark that could lead to an outbreak of serious violence in the US is ever present because these people have been prepping for it for years. So just because there isn't a plan for a specific way in which that violence can materialize does not mean that the idea is out there. And we saw it in Rwanda. So there were, civilians were being armed with machetes, much like militias in the US are stocking up on guns. You had a new radio station, RTLM, which was founded to spread ideas. It says just 1.52% of RTLM's airtime was dedicated to news, while 66.29% of airtime featured the journalists discussing their thoughts on different subjects, mainly anti-Tutsi propaganda. Does that remind you of how the alt-right conducts its propagandizing? Does that remind you of the purpose of channels like Fox News, or worse, Newsmax and OAN? That's exactly the same thing. That's the same parallel. Insulting the Tutsi, calling them inyensi, meaning non-human pests or cockroaches. Where is this language seen as well in American political discourse? Calling your enemies traitors, calling people like Ilhan Omar to be executed, calling immigrants vermin. So this all builds up. This hatred builds up. And then something causes, the fuse to ignite. And you end up with a situation like this, which could have been much worse. I do think if there had been Congress people inside the Capitol when these clowns stormed inside, there could have been Congress people dead. And God knows what could have happened afterwards. And that this was incited by Trump? Definitely. Definitely incited by Trump. He does not need to say, go to the Capitol and, exterminate the Democrats so that I can be in office. That's not what he needs to do. He just needs to open the doors, the floodgates rather, so that his audience, full of freaking psychopaths, can do this. So, yeah, I honestly, I still find it rather funny that now the right-wingers are like, oh yeah, the FBI is saying that it was, the same FBI where for 4 fucking years they didn't believe anything that they said. Now they believe this. But anyway, that is America's far right for you. And that is not just the far right. That is the segment of pundits who simp for the far right, like Glenn Greenwald. So on that note, if you like this video, please like, please share. Most importantly, please subscribe. And I will see you next time.